side note, my other life, I'm the executive director of Zeb's Equine Sanctuary. So we're a rescue and rehabilitation and sanctuary area for elder and special needs equines. We're also a sustainable property. So it's been a passion of mine for many, many years to do what I now have the pleasure of doing for a job. So we work really hard to keep low impact on our very small sanctuary property and keeping our equines healthy, our soil, our water, and our wildlife healthy. The cost of mud, it's kind of a big deal out here. Mud isn't just ugly to look at, but it creates really significant issues, both with the health and productivity of our animals, but it also creates some real environmental disasters. To tell you a little bit about this, in the northern Willamette Valley where I live, we get an average of 42 inches of rain per year and 156 days of rain on average, which is excruciating sometimes. My sanctuary is in the foothills of Mount Hood, and we get double that amount because of the clouds slamming into the mountain and dumping the remainder of their water here. So no wonder we're soaking in mud most of the time. So one thing that I've realized working and visiting landowners here is that we have a tendency to think, especially in the Willamette Valley, that mud is obligatory when we have livestock, and it's not really. And this is why I'm here to talk to you about this today. So why is mud bad? Well, for us, we live with old codgers, and I'm always on the lookout for the old slip and fall issues with mud for my equines. So for us, it's a lot more than everything. It's a physical issue. It's also a feed wasting challenge. It causes so many medical issues with our livestock, including parasite issues, mud-borne bacterial issues, mud fever, chronic thrush, white line disease, abscesses, greasy heels, rain rot, rain scald, and dermophilosis in our buddies. So the list just goes on and on. I can go forever. So if we can avoid mud and contamination, we can avoid a lot of health issues as well with our animals. It also makes mucking and livestock care really hard. If you're a small landowner and you have, one or two critters, oftentimes we're pushing a loaded wheelbarrow through this stuff. Can be backbreaking. If we're using tractors to clean things out, our tractors get stuck. So you've also probably figured out it's a complete environmental nightmare too. So water quality is a big deal with our critter keeping as well as other ag-related practices, by the by. But here we've got a few potential resource and ag water quality concerns here that we deal with a lot in this area. So there are some solutions for our mud. Many of us have small acreages out here, and we're trying to cram a lot of critters on a smaller acreage. I apologize. This presentation can be a little bit horse-centric because I give a lot of horse-related talks, but I mean with all stock. So most landowners don't have an endless amount of land to rotate their herds through and keep it mud-free. Therefore, creation of a hardened heavy use area adjacent to sheds or barns is an effective way to get your critters out of the mud. While it can be a large upfront investment, graveled HUAs pay for themselves in retained feed and lowered vet and production costs in the long run. So it will save your pastures as well from overgrazing, compaction, and erosion, which is a pretty big deal. One of the most important steps when we're looking at graveled heavy use areas is to not skip steps. And I will tell you about this in just a second. So when we excavate to native soil and lay down 8 ounces of 8-ounce non-woven fabric first, and don't worry, I'll repeat this a bunch, there are specs for heavy use areas. So I visit a lot of folks that say, I threw a pile of gravel down there last year and it's gone. I can't believe it. So if you look at this graphic, down below, you can see why we put geotextile fabric down first before we add gravel. So if there's a wheel running over it, there's a whole lot of kind of pumping action that weights, wheels, hooves, whatever, give to the ground. And when the ground is soft under the gravel just goes into the mud and the mud sucks up through the gravel. If you have geotextile fabric down first, there's no pumping action. It's just hitting the gravel. So don't forego the fabric, folks. It's a big deal. I know people say it's a lot of money, but it's a whole lot more money to redo this twice. Let's move on to a demonstration. So this is one of our landowners. They've got a little pile of horses on a very small piece of property that is sloping into a creek. So not only did they decide that under their barn roofs, which were knee deep in mud because of that kind of suction action that goes on during our rainy season, not only were they going to put down the heavy use fabric and do a proper gravel HUA, but because it's on a slope, they're also going to add some grid. In this case, it's a GeoGrid product to hold the gravel in place. So on the left side, you can see Jerry stretching that over the fabric. And you can also see that everybody's in short sleeves here. This kind of work gets done in the summer, not the winter. So I always remind people, in the summer, when you're looking at that dust and really clean, smooth horses or cattle, remember in the winter, it's going to be a nightmare. So you plan in the winter and you implement in the late summer and fall. Here's two of our discriminating ladies at the sanctuary. This is Opal and Toodles. They're enjoying their gravel sacrifice area. And I just wanted to mention too that on the outside of this barn to the transition area is where the wheelbarrow is graveled and then matted on top with a curb, so it keeps bedding from coming out into the gravel area and clogging that. And I also want to notice that make a mention that we have several ferals in our herd as well. And when I grew up in cattle ranching, we certainly weren't doing a lot of hoof care with our cattle, who are range cows, and we relied on the action of the gravel heavy use areas to keep their hooves in check. So we have really beautiful, fabulous hooves, even on our guys that can't get regular hoof care. So there's a lot of bonuses to having these things around. I always recommend adding a heavy use area to whatever existing infrastructure you have, and you might be surprised at what can be used as a heavy use area anyway. So we have this large arena, which is basically our napping area for the old codgers. We added a HUA surrounding that entire arena that our herd can go on in the winter, and they can be shut off of the pastures. So the big deal there is we need to make sure that we are cleaning these regularly, again, because the gravel needs to stay, the pore spaces need to stay open so that moisture can perk down and through the soils. Super important to use the correct size rock as well. That keeps injuries down in your livestock, especially if you have, sheep and goats or any of the small cloven-hooved animals. Use the correct size rock. It's recommended that you use a larger gauge rock at the bottom. For example, in this photo, I just wanted to demonstrate at the very foreground of it, we've got 1.75" minus rock that they used as their base layer. And in the paddock itself is 3/8 minus rock. And that's all been compacted. And that's another recommendation, is that the stuff is compacted mechanically before you put your stock on it. Larger rock, why do people not use larger rock? Larger rock can get lodged in hooves, especially cloven hooves. And it can also add a tremendous amount of sole bruising because of the angles that get embedded. So the small stuff is a lot easier on the animal. So do it right, do it completely, and follow the specs. So if you look at this photo on the left, the gravel, maybe a little bit hard to see here, but the gravel on the right, which is outside, was watered down and mechanically compacted. And the gravel on the left side of that post was not. And you can see that all of the base gravel is coming up, which you do not want. So doing it right the first time is a good deal. And then if you look at the photo on the right, you can see that adding curbs or steps into and out of any place that has bedding is a good idea, or adding rubber mats, again, so you're not mixing a lot of organics into your gravel area. Got to keep these things working well. They're a great investment, but only if you maintain them, just like your car. So here's another way that you can maintain your, you keep mud down and maintain your grasses. And this is kind of a new thing in the Pacific Northwest. It's made to mimic natural movement of animals, and it's a track system. I think us horsey people may have heard it be called the paddock paradise system. So the idea of these things is to add a track or a pathway around the property where the use is concentrated, in particular during the dormancy season for grasses. And to encourage movement along these tracks, you add different resources along that. So you can see on this photo, we've got water in some areas, we've got resting areas in others, salt licks in others, feeding, sand bath. I've seen this done not just with horses, but with a whole lot of different livestock. And again, it's a new way to kind of a new old way to rest up the center of the field to keep your animals moving and to keep pressure low. And these are generally locked in with shelters as well. So just as a heads up on these track systems too, they do make mud, especially here in these wetter areas. There are examples of these track systems all over the world, and England and dry, arid areas like Northern California, desert areas, which obviously don't get terribly muddy, but you will expect to see some mud, and the idea is that the mud is concentrated. They do recommend putting a substrate down on your tracks, and I find that this can be incredibly financially difficult. So we have a track on our place, and we flip the track when it starts to get impacted. So we try to keep the grasses somewhat healthy. Another way to keep mud down is to look at your stormwater runoff and control that stuff. So, so many farms that I visit have no rain gutters on their barns or their outbuildings, or they have a rain gutter with a downspout that just dumps water at the foot of the upright posts for the barn, undermines them, rots them, all sorts of things. So we have a big problem with stormwater runoff now. So much of our land is now covered with hardened surfaces that water just hits these hardened surfaces, runs off, and pollutes everything instead of falling on the ground, which is vegetated and takes time to perk into the soil. So we need to find a way to help that runoff from roofs and parking lots and streets get back into our groundwater stores. Um, why do we need to do that? Well, a lot of us drink from wells, and wells are at aquifers, so that's a very personal reason to do this. But we also want to look at the way that Mother Nature sets up its own stormwater runoff. So wetlands and buffered areas with forests help clean soils of pollutants. So it's such a good idea to replicate that. Let's look at recreating the wheel. So here's the nightmare that I built on our sanctuary. It is a 60 by 80 foot covered arena with awnings. Very lovely. I think I have wanted one for a long time. But as soon as I started planning on building this thing, I realized it's at the bottom of a hill. To the left of this building is a fish-bearing stream. It has an effective buffer on it, but below us is a neighbor. Our driveways act as stormwater runoff kind of flumes during the wet season, so I got a little bit nightmared with it. So we built this big beauty. It's about 5,000 square feet of hardened surface, which means that we lost 5,000 feet of perkable ground. And if we think about our farms and our outbuildings, we think about that amount of water. So just for an example, 5,000 square feet is about 60,000 inches times a half an inch rainfall event is about 130 gallons per minute coming off the roof. So it's substantial. You can do this little calculation too. I didn't add this in your in the comments links, but you can find a way to calculate your roof's runoff to see how much is kind of getting onto your ground and taking your topsoil away. So we needed to find a way, in our case, to keep it from eroding away the area around it, and also keep stormwater runoff out of our neighbors' fields and their barns and their houses, and reclaim it for our very shallow well. So here's what we did. We did our downspouts, and we purchased for 50, 100 total bucks a couple of these trugs that are used for a variety of different things. You can find them for sale for really cheap. It's about 500 gallons of catchment, and I wanted a little bit of water catchment, and I mean a little, just to water the rain garden plants for a couple of years. So we catch part of it. The rest of it drains out of those, and it goes into this monstrosity. This was a wasted piece of our property between the driveway and the building. So If you look at the bottom of the blue arrow, the outfall from those tanks and that roof comes out there. The rain garden is about 20 feet wide by 60 feet long by 10 feet deep. We're solid clay where we're at, so we knew that things don't perk well as they are. We added drain rock in the bottom, and then I took my most composted manure, meaning years and years old, and soil, and filled it up with a slight depression. And then I filled it with about 50 different species of native plants because that's my affliction. So below this rain garden too is a little, if you look at the top of the screen, it looks like a little flume at the top. So anything that might overwhelm that rain garden would flume off around the building and disperse in a grassed strip, meaning a laid up winter pasture behind us. I will tell you this, this is the shot right after I planted it, the first spring. This rain garden has never been overwhelmed, and we've had some epic rain events. So it fills briefly and then perks down through the groundwater. If you want to say, hey, I want things to be pretty, this is the second year after planting these things. And then this is year 4. So it's fully involved. So why put so many plants in there? Well, plants, at least during the growing season, will pull up a lot of moisture. Not only that, they'll hold the soil too. So I want more trees, more shrubs to pull up as much moisture as I can and hold it in the ground. Who can you call if you got some runoff? Well, districts, your district can help you problem solve your mud manure runoff stuff. So let's talk quickly about manure as well. So everybody makes it if you've got livestock. How much do we make? It's good to know. If you're using bedding, how much is there? The stuff can be gold if it's prepared properly. It can be a nightmare if it's not. So it's great for farms if you do the right thing with it. So it just takes a little bit of effort. So just as a fun fact, again, in horsey world, one horse produces about 50 pounds of manure per day or 1 cubic foot per day. So if you go through the year, 365 days a year, you've got 13 and a half cubic yards, more or less doubles with bedding. So many of us bed our livestock. So we can really create a lot of poop there. So here's issues with excess livestock manure. You know, if you're close to neighbors, there's always the, oh God, so many flies, it smells, what have you. There could be potential regulation issues if you're a CAFO or if you're a boarding facility and have improper manure management. This can be an Oregon Department of Agriculture issue. It's unsanitary, bugs, you name it. If you try to haul it off, which a lot of people do, it's very pricey, as are the disposal fees. The good stuff, you know, it's readily compostable. So most manure is going to make a great product and a stable nutrient source for your pastures, gardens, and orchards. And it can be an income source too. Do want to let you know, not all manure is created equal. So you can see the percent nitrogen in each of these animals, and horsey people don't get to, what should I say, on your high horse. Even horse manure is a fantastic polluter if not treated well. So we already talked a bit about why we want to manage our manure, but we have a lot of toxin leaching that comes out of manure, and people think that that's composting if it's just thrown on the ground. It's really not. So improperly managed manure can become anaerobic and stagnant and unable to compost. Can be a bacteria-ridden mess. You've got sick animals, weed seeds don't get processed because it didn't get composted, as well as pathogens don't get composted out. So you could be making quite an environmental nightmare there. This stuff can also hypernutrify surrounding soils. It can be a great parasite sink and rat haven. So there's a lot of nasty that can go on. And I think if any of us that have had livestock have probably been there where we said, this is getting out of hand, I got to figure it out. FYI, again, I grew up with cattle. This is what I grew up with when our cattle were in their holding pens and being fed out for market. Manure piles are not supposed to exist to keep your animals off the manure. This is what I see the most on my visits, and this is an equine facility. They didn't have a tractor, and it got very muddy. So you can see people were wheelbarrowing the manure out. And of course, you can't stack with a wheelbarrow the manure, so it ends up making this long kind of field of poop and soup. And if you look at the back end of this, there was a creek running right behind this as well. So if we're using we often look for the most convenient or chore efficient place to drop our manure because, again, if it's a terrible winter, we're not going to want to walk it across 8 acres of land. So oftentimes these things are within the vicinity of our livestock housing areas as well. Leaving your manure like this uncovered is a big issue, and we'll talk about moisture in a minute, but also it's almost impossible to cover, right? Or to get it stacked high enough to allow any anaerobic action or aerobic action to get started. So let's talk a little bit about composting. So proper management can lead to far fewer health issues and vet bills, which is always nice. Better quality pastures, fewer flies. It can also enhance your property if you just put in a few measures to manage this properly. So there are a lot of different ways to manage your manure, from simple to top of the line. So I'll just take you for a quick walk through all that stuff. So just so you know, this static pile compost, someone in the upper right is doing a good job. They came to one of my talks and said, "Hey, yeah, I took home the one take-home message you had, which is I'm covering my manure in the winter," which I was so impressed with. But I will tell you that if you do a static pile and you cover it like that on the right, it can take years to properly compost. If you actively compost, meaning dry stacking or turning or aerating, and we'll talk about that later, doing turned windrows or in vessel, that can happen. That can compost pretty quickly. So again, you'll compost out a lot of that weed seed and a lot of those pathogens. So when I talk about composting, a properly managed pile is going to heat up between 130 and 160 degrees. So at 131 degrees for 3 days or more, you're going to more or less kill all of your pathogens and most of your weed seeds. So it's a good deal to get it hot, but there are a few things you need to do to get it hot. When you get your manure hot, I know that a lot of us horse people have a heck of a time giving away our compost because it tends to be weedy. But if you say, I compost this properly, and there are very few weed seeds in this, it'll be easier to market. So remember a couple of things: that even as you're composting, you have to make sure that your compost facility is big enough to accommodate all of the compost you're going to want to make there, all the manure you have to store. So oftentimes I give people recommendations for 6 months of storage. So every 6 months you can add it to your pastures or get it shipped off a site or put it in a pile out in the field covered that you can use it later. So I hear a lot of things about compost piles. And there's a lot of misconceptions out there. One of them is, well, I need to leave my pile uncovered for it to work. It needs to get wet. Well, by wetness, we mean only the consistency of a wrung out sponge and not so that it oozes between your fingers. So in general, even with bedding, leaving a pile uncovered is going to make it far too wet for aerobic activity to happen. Other things I hear are covered piles catch fire. So that's fascinating. I have maybe heard of one instance of that, and it was poorly managed barn keeping and not a compost pile. So it was someone leaving their manure in their barn against a wooden wall. So they don't catch fire. They don't typically ever get hot enough for that, although I hear you can cook a chicken in them if they get to a good temp. So the dirty water will never reach my creek or my well is another thing that people say. Well, this stuff, it travels far. And then compost facilities are overkill. So those are the misconceptions. So I'm going to send you today with this answer of like, at least cover it. And in a week, when you get your summary from this class, I hope if you take nothing home, take that home. Cover your manure, cover your manure. You'd be surprised at how even getting a pile tarped can help you with pollution and odors. Tarp piles should be turned, but they can be left for static composting if you need to. Again, it's going to take a long time, and again, it's not going to catch fire. So make sure you anchor your tarps big time. I think the big challenge with tarping our piles is that there's virtually nothing we can put on top of these things that won't be blown off at some point. And usually during the worst weather, when you have the flu and you're inside watching that tarp fly across the fields. So there's some pretty simple solutions out there that can be fairly cheap. Here's a cheap one that we put up at our place with stuff we had laying around. So this manure bin's just created from 3 old round pen panels, rusty old round pen panels, 2 hog panels for the arched top, and a tarp overhead with baling twine holding it down. It's a super salvage job. We had some plywood laying around and some stall mats for underneath, but the thing works great. Again, keeping it covered's key. You can get fancier with this too, and you can add a shelter logic if you want. This is my boss's compost pile, and it works swimmingly. They do turn this pile regularly with a tractor. So, and then when it fills up, they take it and stage it in the field under a tarp. You can get a little fancier than this. You can use manure sheds. This is Harriet and her manure shed. She's in Multnomah County. She got a grant for one of these through her district years ago because she's up adjacent to a wetland. So they wanted to be sure that nothing was going to get from her horse and herd of sheep into that wetland. So she leaves it alone. She doesn't do anything with it with a tractor. And once a year, she removes the composted manure and spreads it on her fields during the dry season. Here's the schmancy version. This is an aerated static system. So this is the one we have installed at our sanctuary. We have a lot of critters going through, and we are, again, adjacent to a fish-bearing stream. So we wanted to make sure absolutely that we could manage and process our manure and compost on site. So this is the unit we decided to go with was an O2 compost system. So it's an aerated static pile system. So you kind of set it and forget it, a little bit like that rotary oven they used to sell online or on TV. So this will make good compost in 3 months or less. It's covered so the rain doesn't get to it. We can sprinkle it with a hose to get moisture levels right. We drop off of the back or put our wheelbarrows in the back. It's a top-down system, and we open the doors up front and pull the stuff out. For us, we don't sell it. We apply some to our fields, but for the most part, we give it away to community gardens and people in need in the area. So it's been a real beautiful addition. How does this sucker work? Well, along the back, there's a little fan, the kind of fan that if any of you have the inflatable Santa Claus over Christmas on your lawn or polar bear, it's the same fan that they use for that. It's on a timer that goes off once an hour for about 30 seconds. The air blows through these white pipes and down into the concrete base and comes up through these plenum boxes at the bottom. So each of these little boards has some space between it. So it basically distributes the air evenly through the pile, which is the challenge with most unturned systems. You can see when a pile gets cooking, it'll hover up there. This is a 2-foot Rio Temp compost thermometer you can get for $50 online. Anybody that has a pile can play along at home and you can see if it's really composting or not. So this becomes the weirdest game you've ever played is watching your compost temps. So again, between 110 and 160 degrees in the center. Ours gets there for a couple of weeks and then it drops and then it rises again when the different bacteria get in there to finish the job. That was pricey. There are far less pricey and more homemade ways to go about this. So you can add the good stuff to your fields. And I'll show you, I think there's a link that we're going to drop in on one of these slides for a homemade aerated static pile system. You can make these things at home. But this is, again, great stuff to add to your fields. Just reminders for this. You want to test your soils first to see what you need for nutrients. You can even test your compost before you put it on to make sure that's the right amount of nutrient to add. We add that in the spring and the fall during the growing seasons. We never add compost in the winter because the plant is dormant and it just runs off. It doesn't actually get utilized by the plant. big reminders, you always want to keep your compost at least 25 feet from open water. And for that matter, it's good to keep your livestock at least 25 feet from open water. This can be a little bit chemically complex to talk about composts and adding things to your field. So you can check with your district. They know how to talk to you about that and give you technical advice as well. Um, just as an FYI too, some districts have no interest or low interest loans that may be able to be provided for some of this stuff. If you have a public facility like a boarding facility, typically that's not the case. That's the cost of doing business, but talk to your district about that too. At the very least, they'll get you some technical advice. We want to keep our pastures healthy. That's the reason for managing our manure and for getting our guys out of there and onto a graveled heavy use area in the winter and the wet months. So range is the most economical feed source. So most of us that grow livestock know about 80% of the cost is their feed. So what if you could save some dough in that feed cost and not have to feed out so much hay, feed out good forage that animal, it's got all the macro and micronutrients that animal needs. So it's a very natural way to feed your animal. And has most of the things that your critter is going to need. So with changing climates and droughts and gosh, hay prices going through the roof in the last couple of years, supply chain issues becoming an issue, we're really feeling hit, I know. So if we could shift the way that we look at our pastures and paddocks as a food source, then we could be in good luck. I don't need to tell you that feeding these guys is pricey and it's getting more expensive every year. So we need to find a way to make our paddocks and pastures pay. So just this is kind of what we're used to seeing, right? I think many of us can nod our heads and go, yep, got that. So this is a kind of an overpressured, I think this is a horse field. There's really no grass growing in anymore. It's been compacted. It's been overgrazed. Weeds got in. So there's just a mountain of pineapple weed and wild mint and tansy ragwort and all sorts of things in this field because of the bare ground that was left open. So the things that can live in more compacted soils and more nutrient deplete soils are there, and the grass doesn't have a prayer. So I just want to show you a little bit about soil loss and erosion as we're going back and looking at that previous scene when we're talking about bare ground. This is a rainfall simulator that I had the good fortune of seeing in action this past summer. So each of these trays was taken from different conditions. The tray on the left, it was taken, soil taken from a forested area. So basically they flip the tray upside down, push it in the soil, flip it back over, and they have an untouched, unfettered soil sample from that area. The second from the left is just plain dirt covered with straw. So you can think of your dusty, muddy paddock you might be throwing feed onto. The second from the right is a healthy, unplowed pasture with well-established grasses. You can see the grasses are anywhere between about 3 inches and 8 inches tall there. And on the right is a plowed field. So think of a dust bowl and the dust bowl. The buckets in the front shows surface runoff from each of these after a 5-minute rain event, which is a pretty average rain event. The buckets in the back, if you can see those, are a little tougher to see, show what's percolating through the soil. So stuff to note here. The grassed area holds the most topsoil and has the cleanest runoff. So look at the runoff from the grassed area, and the bucket in back is very clean, not a lot of soil in there. The plowed field on the right has zero percolation through the soil. When they flipped that back out on the ground, it was dry as a bone underneath the first 1/8 of an inch. Only dirt is running off the surface. The straw-covered soil is almost half as much runoff as the plowed field, but it's still got a lot of bad runoff. So when I look at that, I think of kind of our feeding paddocks. So talking a little bit about pastures. So a way to think about our pastures or our paddocks, I think of a pasture as being something that's 1 acre or bigger, or 2 acres or bigger. Most of us just run on our small acreages, run animals on paddocks. So we're really just grass farmers with livestock. So I'm just thinking of this in terms of horses. So aren't we in a conundrum, especially as horse people in the Willamette Valley? Too much grass is going to kill our animals. Too little grass can kill our animals. And too many of the wrong weeds can kill our animals. So we have a delicate line to walk. So someone once told me with our livestock, we're really just the grass farmer, and the cute things in the field are a bonus, or the delicious things in the field are a bonus. So what does that mean? It means that if we manage our fields and grazing properly, we can keep our livestock healthier by providing them with the nutrients they're designed to get out of a pasture and off of grasses. It saves us money. It's good for the environment, good for water quality, good for fish, and good for us ultimately. So let's talk about what makes a healthy grass underground. So this is a sample of a pasture that was being that had a backhoe taken to it. I was enamored of it. So if you look at the frame on the left, you've got 3 inches of grass growing up top, and that's when they pull their livestock off. Is at 3 inches. And underground, I was dumbfounded to see the root system there. So very thick roots. The big white balls in there are mycorrhizal fungi, and they are the fungal network that helps these things get sassy and big and run more roots and more tillers. So it's a very healthy system underground as well. And the soil was dark and porous and beautiful. So this is a really healthy pasture. So when we talk about keeping pastures from getting overgrazed, I want you to look at the top, and I want you to think about what's underneath too and how important that is, because all of those roots help keep airspace in the soils. They help nutrients percolate down into the soils. When we put those horse hooves or those livestock hooves on those things repeatedly throughout the winter, we're compressing those spaces. One way to keep this stuff fresh and good, besides that track system, is rotational grazing. So if you can do rotational grazing, you're in really good shape. So we got to give our pastures a rest from grazing, especially when our grasses are dormant. So if you want to know when our grasses are dormant, you can probably figure that out when it stops growing in the late fall through the early spring. But if you want to know really the months when your grass's growth periods are at their highest, and then the dormancy periods, when you have no growth, you can contact your Soil and Water Conservation District, and they can work up a soils report and a growth curve sheet from you. So very interesting stuff. It's a new way to look at your pastures. And that's according to your specific soils and their characteristics. But if you're really adventurous, you can go to the Web Soil Survey and enter your address in, and then find what kind of soils you have on your property and their associated drainage class. But we've dropped a Web Soil Survey link in the comments for you too, if you want to get in that rabbit hole. Otherwise, call your conservation district. So when I talk about a little bit about that stubble health or the pasture health, I want you to look at the roots on this figure up above. So the root response, if it gets down to 3 inches, is the plant sends out more roots. So it gets healthier, it sends out tillers, it says I have to grow more plant, I'm getting a little bit stressed. That's when you pull your animals off. If you keep going and you get that field down to, the pool table, then you can see on the far right, the grass plant is so stressed out, the roots start dying off. It can't put runners or tillers out, and you're basically killing what little grass you have left. So having a longer recovery is a good plan. A short graze, a long recovery. You can see that middle one, a long graze and a short recovery. It's still better than nothing, but continuous is the hardest. And if you look at these, the figure down below, you can see that I just threw this figure in. It's a 100-acre undivided pasture, but we can divide these into some pretty small paddocks. So whatever you've got, you can probably rotate it. So think about that for your areas too. Here are a couple examples of rotational grazing plans that might be easy for you to implement too. Basically having pastures that pop off of your confinement area. So I love those the most because you can always lay up several pastures at once. And then you have your gravel heavy use area and your barn and your center for work. And then you can rest 3 and graze 1, rest 4, graze 2, what have you. So what makes great grass? Great soil. We've already talked about this a couple of times, but we really want to make sure that we have this great buildup of soil organic matter. We want to reduce the disturbance of your soil. We want to have that good solid soil structure and good organic matter again. This is why we apply our composted manure back onto our fields if needed, and amend the fields as we need as well. And again, you want to test your soils. You can send them soil samples to soil testing labs, and they can give you your construct. Think about that soil food web. So you want to increase that beneficial bacteria, all that beautiful mycorrhizal fungi and enzymes that we looked at there in the previous picture. Gives us really good soil tilth and good nutrient uptake, so everybody's healthy in there. Water infiltrates, so we don't need to have things running off. A lot of water can be held in a healthy pasture too, and a lot of carbon can be held in a healthy pasture too. So we have healthy soils make healthy animals, which is good. So rest your pastures, people. For fertilization, again, we want to think about that spring and fall growth times, but you want to have that 4 R's of nutrient management, the right fertilizer, the right time, the right rate, and the right place. So when you're adding compost back to your pastures, you want to add that at agronomic rates, which is around 1/4 of an inch or less, again, after you test your pastures. Who can help you do that? The district. We can come out, we can do a lot of things for you. We can ID the grasses that you have, your growing seasons. We can even help you with finding optimal grasses to plant for the stock that you have and for the types of soils that you have, planting densities. We can identify weeds for you and give you treatment options and even show you how many animals you can graze there or the AUMs of your site. Um, and when you can graze them and for how long. So technical assistance from your district is such a handy thing to have. And I would highly recommend that everybody take advantage. Sometimes you don't even know what you need. And it's just, can you come out and take a walk and see how we're doing? So I'm going to give you a couple of final thoughts on this. I can't believe we're buzzing through this. So keep more grass, less room for weeds, rotate, rotate, rotate. When the conditions are wet and rainy, excuse me, use your heavy use areas. Keep your critters out of the streams and water sources. So have that buffer between any water source. What's the big one? Cover your poop, right? Cover, cover, cover. And then plant and keep trees and shrubs in any of your buffer areas so that they can pull up nutrients before they get into wells and waterways. Going to give you a little side note. One mature Douglas fir tree can take up, hold, and transpire about 150 gallons per day. So if you translate that, a tree will take up about 10 gallons of water per 1 inch of DBH or of radius. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about taking trees out, that those trees are really integral to keeping erosion from happening. And then keep your native trees and hedgerows, et cetera, around. Plant those to keep that mud and runoff to a minimum. And on a kind of a final note here, I want to just talk about partners a little bit too. So the Farm Service Agency and the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, are all, we work with those very closely. So for folks that are ag producers or may make money off of their agricultural endeavors, there may be additional funding and assistance and resources available to you through FSA and the NRCS. So chat with your district planner about whether you may qualify for any of that program. They have incentive programs for planting riparian areas, for laying up fields, for improved irrigation, for off-channel water, all sorts of things. So talk to your district about that.
Your slide about the track system, what did you mean by flip the track?
Oh, flip the track. Sorry. Yes, flip the track. So the track, generally you put a track up against a solid piece of fencing, so you are only fencing one side. What we do is we actually fence the inside of that interior fencing too, to make an interior track. So we'll get the guys off the outer track and put them on the other one and let the outside recover, so we don't end up with a slip and slide.
How would you recommend keeping goat and sheep manure picked up from those gravel A2As so that the pores don't get? That's more difficult. I know I am a sheep and goat person, and I've been trying to think about that too. Like, how am I gonna not make it too hard on myself to get it cleaned up?
Yeah, totally. And I was a goat person for a long time too. So I get like, why can't you guys poop just a whisper bigger? I've used weirdly enough, just brooms and shovels because I pick up every day. If you have 30 sheep, this may not be the best option for you. With larger numbers of livestock on these graveled heavy use areas, you can have some loss, but you can do in the past, I've flipped my tractor bucket and put it on float and just taken off that top layer if I've had to. But the key is to really try to keep that stuff picked up on a couple of time a week basis at least.
Do you recommend aerating pastures?
If that's a really good question. So I think that's a yes, if needed. Aeration is totally fine in a lot of places where if a pasture is so compacted, it may be a good option, but aeration still opens up space for weeds. So I've known a lot of pasture folks that instead of revamping their whole pasture, they've used a no-till drill to simply kind of add seed to their pastures. It's just a small ripper, so instead of holes. But certainly talk to your district person about that. They may want to come out and take a peek and give you the right advice.
And do you know what types of grasses would be better for the Pacific Northwest pastures?
Oh, well, again, it'll depend somewhat on your soil type. So it's a little bit hard to say. If you go in I think up here, I recommend a lot of the kind of ryegrasses, tall fescues, um, there are Pacific Northwest pasture grass mixes, which tend to be great. I like to add legumes in as well. So, um, so I have increased nitrification of the soil. Again, it's going to be something that you will want to ask your district person about. If you look at your soil type, if you want to dive into that, and then if you look at pasture patability charts, so well-drained soils. There are charts for each of those, and you'll see recommended pasture plants for each of those. So if you want to dive in, and I can also give you those resources in an email afterwards. So you can all see if you have well-drained, somewhat well-drained, steep soils, what have you, and I can give you those sheets as well.
Other links in the chat. There is a link to our YouTube channel so that you'll be able to see this presentation after it's put onto there. You have many comments of thank you. So once again, I'm going to echo that. Thank you very much for presenting to us today. Also in the chat, there are a couple links from our district website. One of them is for a conservation directory. So if you're looking for a place to get your soil tested or looking for a place to help you put some fencing in or many other things, there is a conservation directory on our website. And there's also a link in the chat. Marion SWCD is fortunate to be able to offer some conservation assistance grants. So if you think that you would love to implement some of these techniques, but maybe you need some financial assistance to do so, you can contact us and we might be able to help you with that.